Good morning. My name is Annette Clark, and I'm the very proud Dean of Seattle University School of Law. Welcome to City. This is our Summer Institute for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. And more specifically, this is our City 2000, Innovating the Built Environment, How the Law Responds to Disruptive Change Symposium. It's so great to have you all here with us. We're broadcasting from rainy Seattle this morning. I know we have folks from all over the country. Our City Institute is in its second summer with 5 course offerings and 2 conferences and symposia. I want to start us off this morning by extending particular thanks to Adjunct Professor Peter Smirnotopoulos, who also teaches at the University of Michigan. It's really been his vision to expand his City class, which is Innovating the Built Environment, into a community event, and this year into a national virtual event. Over the course of today, we'll have at least 16 speakers and thought leaders, both locally and nationally, including at least 3 Seattle University Law graduates, of whom we are so proud, several of our adjunct professors, and a variety of industry professionals and government leaders locally and across the country. I am also pleased to let you know that our new Seattle Journal of Technology, Environmental, and Innovation Law has student representatives attending today, and they're hoping to publish some of the speakers and the proceedings, and we'll have the chance to introduce them later this morning. A special thanks to CREW, that's the Commercial Real Estate Women Northwest, the organization that is once again participating and planning the opening panel on the intersection of land use and affordable housing. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Stephen Bender. He's not just a professor and a faculty member, he is our Associate Dean for Planning and Strategic Initiatives. And really, I want to give kudos to Dean Bender. City, our Summer Institute for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, was absolutely his brainchild. He came to us from the University of Oregon in 2011. He was a longtime professor there, a leader in entrepreneurship, ran their Portland program. He's been such a wonderful person to have on our faculty. I rely on him, particularly for his expertise in entrepreneurship. He is the author of a real estate transactions casebook, and he's also something of a Renaissance man. In addition to his expertise in real estate, he also is one of the country's experts on immigration and race in the law. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dean and Professor Stephen Bender.
Thank you so much, and to everybody in our growing audience. And as Annette mentioned, we're very proud of our City program in its second year this year, our Summer Institute for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. As Annette said, we have 5 classes. I co-teach one of them, which is Lawyering for Entrepreneurship, which is a 1-week immersion that we've moved with COVID to late August. It has embedded in it a 1-day symposium conference on data privacy and technology in settings that range from AI and facial recognition technology, which is a controversial topic now and really since its inception, and also data privacy and data uses in the context of contact tracing with the current pandemic. We also have an and so I'll be putting, and the law school will be publicizing details for that Friday, late August conference and symposium as part of that class. We also have a class on artificial intelligence taught by Mark Chinin, our faculty member, and Jennifer Dumas, who's counsel for the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. We have a counseling startups class that Paul Schwiegel, who is an award winner, a corporate counsel awardee from the Puget Sound Business Journal. He's teaching that class. He's also joining the conference later today. We have a class on the role of in-house counsel, which Maya Larson, our Seattle University law graduate, who is the general counsel for the Allen Institute, is teaching. And of course, we have Peter's course that brings us all here, gathers us all here collectively in Seattle and across the country this morning. And today, the Innovating the Built Environment course. And I'm going to turn you over to Peter, who's in turn going to turn you over to our first panel. And Peter probably has bigger pandemic hair than I do, but he's coming to us from Michigan, where he teaches real estate courses in the University of Michigan, and he also contributes as a real estate contributor cutting edge articles to Forbes magazine. And so Peter Smirniotopoulos, who has put together this great panel coming up and also this great day, and a special thanks to Crew for once again joining us and launching the conference.
Great, thank you, Dean Bender, for that excellent introduction. Dean Clark, as always, a pleasure to have you open the symposium for us. Steve, I just want to, I've remarked repeatedly on various forums that not only has Irony left the building, but Irony has gotten on a plane and flown to a remote island. As of Monday, barbershops and hairstylists are reopening. So 2 days too late. I want to extend to all of our panel participants, featured speakers, and of course attendees, greetings from Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I'm broadcasting from my secret volcano lair. And I also want to comment that it's truly refreshing after 3 months of lockdown in Michigan to be wearing pants that require a belt. And that is, of course, if you include shorts as part of the subset of pants. This relationship with Seattle University and the Seattle University School of Law goes back to late 2016 when I met with Dean Clark and Joe Phillips, the Dean of the Albert School of Business, to talk to them about creating some innovative curriculum, possibly between the two schools. And they were kind enough to introduce me to Dean Bender. And although Dean Bender and I have arguably competing textbooks, we really hit things off quite well. One, because we both taught real estate law. Two, because we are both focusing on innovating law school, and in my case, graduate school MBA curriculum. And three, because we both had a deep love of West Seattle, where Steve lives and where my wife at the time was living. So by way of just brief background, Steve and I started collaborating in August of 2018 when he reached out to me and said, hey, I have this idea to create this summer institute. Are you interested in participating? And I was very interesting. And my dilemma at the time, I was teaching in the MBA program at GW, the George Washington University. My dilemma was how to convert this, which I teach in a 14-week 3-credit. Wait a minute, isn't there supposed to be a 1-800 number flashing on my screen as to where people can call and purchase this? All right, maybe we'll fix that later. So the dilemma was how to adapt a 14-week 3-credit course on real estate law and have it fit into the theme and the zeitgeist of the Summer Institute. And what Dean Bender and I came up with was this notion of teaching 4 special topics each semester. So this is the second annual course at City. And so basically to teach real estate law through the lens of these 4 topics. So I think we've managed to create a very interesting and compelling course for students, and this City 2020 Symposium is an integral part of that. So all of my students in the course, today's symposium is part of their substantive content for what we're trying to get across. Hang on 1 second. Oh, what? I have a note saying show the book again. All right. So this year's 4 special topics, and we will go through them, not necessarily in this rote order. Topic 1, and this is our first session topic, courtesy of Crew Seattle. Is there still a place in Seattle for the single-family detached housing typology, given the acute need for affordable housing? The second topic is when worlds collide, how an 86-year-old federal law the Securities Act of 1933, exposed the flaws in WeWork's quote-unquote innovative business model. Topic number 3, what would it take to connect all of Greater Seattle's neighborhoods with walking and biking trails? And 4 is tokenization, the next great leap forward needed to make home ownership more appealing to millennials and Gen Zs. So I want to make a final sort of overarching observation with regard to where we find ourselves. First of all, if we were physically located at Sullivan Hall, we would find ourselves in the midst of or near the Chaz. You know, that's something that I don't want to just gloss over or not mention. I teach my financing real estate development students at Michigan a couple of axioms. One is the only thing that's constant is change. And the second one is do good work. And by that, I mean work that not only serves whatever the profit motivation may be, but that serves the greater community at large. So under the rubric of the only thing that's constant is change, we've had 5.5 months of novel coronavirus pandemic. Most of us have had 3 months of a lockdown, and we've now have 3 weeks of peaceful civil protest following the Memorial Day killing of George Floyd in the custody of the Minneapolis PD, which frankly made me wonder before coming on this morning what new problem or issue is going to arise with which we need to grapple in a sensitive and compassionate manner. So this is, I think, truly an exciting time for Seattle University and the School of Law to be hosting the Summer Institute again this year, focusing on technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And now I am very pleased for the second year in a row to be working with Crew Seattle and with Jean Marie Carnado in particular. They will be our leadoff panel again this year. Jean Marie is an affordable housing advocate with a decade of experience. She started her career as an asset manager for a nonprofit developer in Southern California, and also worked in construction lending and portfolio management for US Bank. Prior to joining the debt and structured finance team for CBRE Affordable Housing, where she has been for the past 3 years, Jean Marie graduated at the top of her class with an MBA from the University of Bath in the UK. She is actively involved in the Urban Land Institute on the 2020 Board of Directors for Commercial Real Estate Women Seattle, and president of the board of Environmental Works, a nonprofit community-based architecture firm. And she also is very, very intimately involved in the executive management and leadership of Crew Seattle. So before I fully turn it over to Jean Marie, I just want to give a shout out to Madison Koval, who has worked extremely hard behind the scenes in getting today's Crew Seattle organized and ready to present. And so with that, Jean Marie, please take the helm.
Hi, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting us to host this panel on behalf of Commercial Real Estate Women, or Crew, and for being part of this symposium. A little bit about Crew. Crew is dedicated to advancing the success of women in commercial real estate. Crew's network membership of more than 11,000 professionals in over 75 global markets represents all aspects of commercial real estate. The organization engages in research into gender parity, provides scholarships for the advancement of women in the field, sponsors mentoring opportunities, as well as hosting educational and outreach events such as our panel today. So we're really excited to be here. A few housekeeping items first. All participants are automatically muted. Madison is going to be helping us to monitor the entire panel and session. So chat and video functions are turned off, but we are going to try to post, and I think it might already be up there, an acronym list you'll see in the chat feature. I think it's in chat, not Q&A, where we're going to have a couple of just different acronyms that are specific to affordable housing and 1 or 2 definitions that are specific to Seattle, just to make sure in case there's something that you don't recognize. Okay, Madison just posted that in the chat. Madison, there's something showing up on the screen there. So the Q&A function will be open throughout the session. Questions are going to be answered at the end of the panel. You'll see when you put questions in the Q&A section, there should be a little thumbs up where you can upvote a question if you really want to make sure that it gets answered. So a little bit about the panel. I just wanted to kind of start off saying, as Madison mentioned, I'm a long-time affordable housing advocate. I'm also somebody who grew up in a very stereotypical single-family home. And so the intersection of these topics is really interesting to me. And I also think it's a really important question to ask about this intersection of single-family versus multifamily and how it impacts affordability. So I'm very honored to put this talk together with our esteemed panelists to hear their thoughts on this issue. Zoning specifically is an incredibly important piece of this truly puzzling problem of affordability. But I think as we will hear today from our panelists, there are many other pieces and players that we need to make this picture come together. And this topic is more relevant than ever. Affordability is at the intersection of housing and social justice, and it is a significant factor in the income and racial divide that we have in this country. For systemic change to happen, we need to continue to unwind the lasting impacts of redlining in real estate that has left scars on our urban landscape. So I'm hoping that we can touch a little bit on this today too, and the ways that housing affordability impacts inequality and promotes equality. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist I'm going to introduce today is Tori Laughlin-Taylor. Tori is a real estate advisor providing development strategy and targeted project management services that support the creation of more economically equitable housing in our region. Her particular focus is on leveraging non-traditional sources of private capital to achieve housing affordability. She brings a breadth of knowledge and wisdom built on 3 decades of experience acquiring, financing, developing, and operating multifamily housing, and more than a decade of experience in leadership of community-focused real estate organizations. A Seattle native, she's a graduate of Harvard College and has an MBA in real estate finance and development from George Washington University. Our next panelist is Colin Morgan Krauss. Colin is Director for Real Estate Development at Mercy Housing Northwest. And if you're not familiar with Mercy Housing, they're one of the largest, if not the largest, nonprofit affordable housing developer nationwide. So really an incredible organization. And Colin heads up their Northwest Division, where he leads the development and preservation of affordable housing throughout the Pacific Northwest. Over the last 7 years, Colin has helped to create or preserve 800 units of affordable housing across Washington state, bringing experience in complex mixed-use projects with a variety of financing strategies in both urban and suburban markets. Colin is particularly interested in expanding long-term affordable housing opportunities for families and seniors, and creating housing environments that allow both residents and wider communities to thrive. Colin has a Master's of Public Administration and a Master's of Urban Planning from the University of Washington and a Bachelor's from New York University. Our next panelist, our final panelist today, is Emily Alvarado. Emily is the director at the City of Seattle Office of Housing, where she directs the work of senior managers in the areas of rental production and preservation, asset management, home ownership and weatherization, policy and planning, and finance. Previously, Emily was the manager of policy and equitable development, where she led policy and program development, place-based equitable development work, and affordable housing incentive programs. Emily spent 6 years in the nonprofit sector, engaged in housing and community benefits, policy and advocacy efforts, including at the Housing Development Consortium for Seattle-King County, the Housing Consortium of Everett and Snohomish Counties, and Pittsburgh United. Emily has a Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington and a bachelor's from Scripps College. We're really excited to have all of our panelists with us today. So let's kick it off with Emily. And she's going to start off by giving us a bit of an overview and background of residential zoning in Seattle and where we are today. And then from there, we'll open it up to our full panel discussion. Emily?
Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute privilege to be here today, and I'm really excited to engage in this discussion. As you could tell from the picture that was just shown, I'm also plagued with the coronavirus hair issues, so you'll humor me and we can have a good intellectual discussion without noticing that. So I've been asked to talk about zoning and affordable housing. And as you'll see from my comments that come throughout this presentation, I really believe that zoning is one issue, as Jean Marie had said, that impacts affordable housing, but it's not the only issue. And so you'll hear that nuance and caveat throughout my presentation. Also for folks outside of Seattle, I'm going to give a couple of Seattle examples, so I hope you'll bear with me. I think they help represent and provide some clarity on the issues that we're talking about. So zoning in general, just to kick it off, right, this is what governs the use of development of land in Seattle and across the country. And zoning districts specify a category of use. It can be single-family residential, multifamily residential, commercial, industrial, etc. And those land uses are applied to the city and the official land use map by ordinance, which means that our municipal leaders are voting to put that land use action in place. But it's really important from my perspective, especially in these times, as the professor had mentioned earlier, when issues of racial equity and racial inequity and justice are at the forefront, to really dig a little deeper into zoning and the land use map right now that's reflective of zoning. I think we need to start by looking at our racial history. Seattle has a long and extensive history of racially restrictive covenants and housing segregation in Seattle. And throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s, restrictive covenants really played a major role in dictating municipal demographics and in figuring out and defining neighborhood growth and development. And so neighborhoods in North Seattle, in West Seattle, where I live, in suburbs of Lake Washington, all adopted deed restrictions to keep out non-white families and to keep out Jewish families as well to some extent. And by the 1920s, people of color really had very few options of where families could live in Seattle. And the popular use of those racial covenants really emerged in 1917. I'm probably wading into a territory in which one of your law professors should be teaching this instead. But the US Supreme Court had deemed that racial segregation ordinances were illegal. And so in practice, racial covenants really removed the need for zoning ordinances. And in that way, they really serve to segregate our cities without blame to municipal leaders. As I had mentioned before, it's the municipal leaders who pass those zoning ordinances. And so while covenants lost the force of law after 1948, the map of segregation, which I should have projected on this screen, really helped create lasting impact in Seattle. And so while covenants and really the redlining practices that Jean Marie mentioned that really followed some of the covenants are not zoning per se. The history of racism and segregation and exclusion is tied to our current land use experience and has to be front and center as we talk about the impacts of zoning. So a little bit of a pivot here. In Seattle, we think about growth and zoning and land use based on Washington's Growth Management Act, which requires cities and counties in the state of Washington to prepare what are called comprehensive plans that show how we'll manage the population growth that the state has projected for each county. And it sets some really key goals that comprehensive plans address, and that includes reducing sprawl, encouraging future development near services and facilities, maintaining public transportation, housing, and open space. Interestingly, it has a key component of protecting property rights and then also protecting the natural environment. And the City of Seattle's last comprehensive plan was established in 2018 that really is filling out this obligation under the Growth Management Act. And in that comprehensive plan, you see something called the City of Seattle's Urban Village Strategy. And this is really the way in which we approach growth in the City of Seattle, or have done so historically. And basically, the Urban Village Strategy directs growth to existing urban centers and villages. These are places where density and stores and parks and transit already exist. And it looks to monitor growth where low-income households and people of color are at risk of displacement. And it also helps to reinforce benefits of city investments in transit and parks and community centers and others. So that concept of the urban village is really important, because the way it plays out is that we have areas of multifamily zoning, residential, mixed use, or commercial, and then we have areas of single family zoning. And in some ways, the urban village strategy was a balancing act in helping to think about how we grow and have density and have options, and also how we preserve single family neighborhoods. And I think that's an ongoing conversation of what is the right balance and how much is the balance of that addressing key issues that we have, like growth, affordability, displacement, et cetera. So in a period of tremendous growth over the last few years, in which we outpaced population predictions that were set by the comprehensive plan, the city undertook an effort to consider the extent to which it should change zoning and link our zoning to creating affordable housing benefits. That policy, which is known locally as the Mandatory Housing Affordability, or MHA, is known nationally more explicitly, quite frankly, as inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, which links this idea again of zoning with affordability. And so during that time of growth, when we were really considering how do we absorb this tremendous population growth that we're experiencing, planning on the ground for a zoning capacity that's meant to accommodate a different population, how do we balance that? And so we introduced zoning, what are called up zones, throughout the city, targeted in multifamily zones, or zones in which you could already build multifamily housing, and in commercial zones. And we increased the zoning capacity, and in exchange, property owners and developers, once that property is redeveloped, would need to contribute to affordable housing by doing one or two things. One, they could make a payment to our office. I have the privilege of stewarding those resources to invest in affordable housing. Or two, they could create affordable housing on site that brings with it a covenant to ensure affordability for the long term. And the goal there was that we could create thousands of new affordable units baked into the city's map as we grow. And the policy, I think, you know, the political and community engagement strategy that surrounded adopting that policy was really complex, and people have a real strong feelings about what it looks like to grow as a city. And so I think the reactions were more about growth than about zoning per se. But one minor piece of the policy did shift some, I think it's 6% of single family zones, to accommodate more intensive development, which is really, I think, close to the conversation that we're having today. So one last pivot, and then I'm probably above time. Jean Marie, you'll cut me off. One last thing is to reflect on the City of Seattle's existing pool of affordable housing. So for folks out there who don't know, we have about 16,000 rent and income restricted units that are asset managed or watched over by the City of Seattle. And those units ensure that low-income people who are income eligible have an opportunity to live in our city, and those units are affordable typically for at least 50 years. I want to mention one thing, which is that of those 16,000 units, the vast majority are in multifamily zones. And that's in part because the way in which we can create affordable housing primarily through financing and other mechanisms, which I'm sure Tori will talk about later, are in apartment buildings. And so that naturally aligns with multifamily zoning. Now, it is true that some of the units that we have are in single family homes that were built as group homes or something else. So there is a way to accommodate affordability in single family homes, but most of the strategies we have are to align affordable housing with multifamily zoning. So it's, I'll wrap up. I'll just say, as we move forward in this conversation, a few things to think about, just to put it out there. One is 69% of the city of Seattle is zoned single family. So it's a lot of land that we're talking about. And two, how we create affordable housing, we'll keep asking questions of how that aligns with different zoning options. And then three, we have to keep racial equity front and center in any decision and conversation that we have as it relates to land use and affordability.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily, for that great introduction and history. Even I didn't realize 69% of our area is zoned single family. And so that really sets us up well for our first question, which I'm going to kick to Tori first, but then open it up to Colin and any other comments. And that's this question of how does and how historically has the zoning map of Seattle impacted affordable housing?
It's really, I mean, I love this question. It's so provocative. And my, having lived through, as Seattle native, lived through so many of these changes from growing up in a, you know, right in the heart, in the period of redlining where we were dealing with that issue, center, and then as a developer working through some different changes in our land use approaches and evolution of zoning that Emily covered. I find it just particularly provocative, and a few things. I just want to frame this by reiterating something Emily said, and that is that we can't just focus on the zoning. There's a few things we have to really bear in mind. It's the zoning sets the stage, obviously, for what can be built, but it doesn't fundamentally achieve the production of housing, whether it be affordable or otherwise. What achieves the production of housing in our American system are the businesses behind it and the development business structure and the capital, cost of capital, the demands that it drives. So we need to talk about development financing part and parcel with zoning. And often we get wrapped up in this notion that zoning is the solution. It's the foundation, perhaps. It provides the opportunity. But if we lead with the zoning without having good mechanisms to ensure that what we want to see gets developed, which means capital mechanisms and various options, we can end up with unintended negative consequences. So more displacement and more issues that we don't want to see. So I just kind of wanted to lead by reminding us of that we really need to be cognizant of the multifamily development models in particular, because most of what we can do, as Emily's reminded us, in affordability is through multifamily. That's frankly where you get to scale. That's where you can deliver the capital at scale. And it's the way to get the lowest cost per unit of housing. So we in our city have, and I'll kick this to Colin to speak a little bit more specifically and tangibly about some of our mechanisms and what works and what doesn't in getting affordability and interface with zoning. But we have to remember that our system of delivery of housing has a few different components to it. The primary one, and the place that we've seen the greatest growth and delivery of like over 15,000 units a year, I think, in recent years of multifamily housing has been, or of housing, I should say, has been by private market. The current general business plan of that is you build is a fairly rapid profit turn approach. You build, you lease up, you get it stabilized, you sell. That drives higher end rents. I mean, it produces at the high end of the market. It doesn't produce at the affordable end. And we've really seen a tremendous, very dramatic broadening out of our affordabilities options in Seattle during this period. So short story, the other end of the spectrum, what I call it the old fashioned model, but we're lucky in Seattle to have a lot of nonprofit real estate developers and operators working with us here, is I call it the old fashioned model because it's the old you build for income approach. You develop and you hold a property long term. Usually there's not much, there's even a negative profit in the early years, or a negative cash position in the early years, but over time you have a more stable and long-term affordable option. So that that's to reiterate the point, we have to be talking about the financing and the operating models behind this in conjunction with the zoning, because as we make changes in zoning, you can otherwise have an unintended consequence of actually driving displacement. So in the interest of time, I want to get it more tangibly to Colin, and he can speak to a little bit more.
Thanks, Tori. I wanted to talk a little bit about, from a nonprofit affordable housing developer perspective, really start off with where the system works now. And now Emily had a really good description of the kind of current framework for zoning in Seattle. And I think all of us would agree that we need more housing in general, and really of all types. But it's really not just about building units. It's really about what the housing does for people who end up living in it and the communities around it. So in that sense, so much of what we talk about when we talk about housing really is access to opportunity. And that's one area where the urban villages model has worked very well. Where the city has made larger investments in communities, whether that's light rail or parks or schools, that's where the opportunities are. That's where we should have more people living and more dense housing. So prioritizing it, or managing density through those different lenses throughout the city, I think is really important. And we can probably expand that, but I do think it's a framework that can work. Emily also mentioned the mandatory housing affordability, the MHA, and that really did provide an opportunity both to develop more housing across the city of all different types, but also to recapture some of the value, if you will, that was created by that for developers that are developing in areas that have seen high displacement risk, or actually have been displaced, to provide a mechanism to reduce that displacement and to provide, again, more of the long-term affordable housing options. This also works really well, that kind of current zoning structures for kind of the mid-height multifamily that Tori was talking about. It's the most efficient building form that most of our developments are that, and so consequently, it's the form that most developments across the city take. That's kind of the 5 to 8 stories. And we've really grown those mid-zones around urban villages recently, and really should continue to do so. So that's anyway, a couple of examples of where it's worked well. On challenges, I think one big area that we grapple with is just that there are different versions of affordability. Affordability means different things. And not all housing types are produced equally or to meet the need. And zoning really is agnostic about affordability. So to me, as a nonprofit affordable housing developer, what affordable housing means is long-term, publicly subsidized rental housing, affordable, up to a certain income level. And for us, the people that live in our housing, they tend to be lower wage workers, but it just don't have other options in the city currently. But There's also affordable home ownership. There's supportive housing for high needs or formerly homeless. There's naturally occurring affordable housing. So all these different housing types are really, we just need more of and need more opportunities. And one of the other challenges that comes in that we've seen just in some of the up zones is really around urban villages or around areas where there are access to opportunities is really these edge zones with lower density housing. And it's much more difficult to provide and build affordable long-term affordable housing in a low rise scale. And as Emily was mentioning, nearly 70% of the city is still single family, and that's a really difficult typology to build affordable housing in. So I think part of the discussion does need to be how we look at single family zones and how to introduce some affordability.
So this is you really kind of teed me up very well for this next question. And it's kind of, and I think this is even a bit more provocative than the last one. We're going to kind of face this head on. And that is, do we need to eliminate single family zoning in order to achieve affordability? Or are there ways to make it happen? And kind of hoping that maybe Emily can start us off with this one with that city perspective of, okay, we've got 69% of our area is zoned single family. Like, do we need to just say no more?
Yeah, thanks, Jean Marie. As a classic bureaucrat in this moment, I'm going to reframe that totally head-on question and make it a little more subtle, and say that in my view, yeah, right. In my view, maybe this isn't, do we have to eliminate single-family zoning? But rather the question is, what are the barriers to producing more affordable housing at scale? And in what order do we need to take on those barriers? And I bring up the framework of barriers in part going back to my opening comments that racial equity really needs to be at center here, is that in the 1964 Civil Rights, Fair Housing Act that was passed at the federal level, there were a couple of things that were done in that act that I think people know a lot about, ending segregation and discrimination kind of explicitly in housing by, disallowing discrimination in the sale, lease, rent, or financing of housing. But it also did another thing that a lot of people don't know, and it introduced a concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing and really put on local jurisdictions an obligation to take steps that removes barriers to creating fair housing. Now, I want to be clear, I recognize that affordable housing and fair housing are not one and the same, but they are significantly related as we look at the disproportionate impact that poverty has on communities of color and people of color, that they're strongly interrelated, but they aren't one and the same. So under Obama's administration, there was a rule that came out that said cities actually have to do explicit planning on how they're going to take down these barriers to creating fair housing. And the city of Seattle submitted our assessment for fair housing, which is what it was called, in 2017. And in that year, we identify a range of barriers, of which zoning is one. But it's not the only one. There are many others. And I will say, just notably pointing out that obligation to affirmatively further fair housing by doing this assessment has been recently taken down by the Trump administration. But I think that the impacts and the analysis that we did is still really important. So all of that framing is to say that there are places where we see that single family zoning in and of itself has been a clear barrier to creating affordability. One example is that there is a former Army base in Fort Lawton, which for folks who don't know Seattle's geography, it's in a neighborhood adjacent to a very big regional park and single family zoning in a neighborhood which, as Colin mentioned, has a lot of high opportunity, good schools, parks, great place to raise your kids. The former Army base that we had an opportunity to turn into affordable housing, because of its existing zoning, you have to do two things. One is plan, well, maybe three. One is plan to get the land for affordable housing. 2, you then need to change the zoning, the underlying zoning, through zoning changes, which are really challenging to effectuate. And then 3, you got to figure out the financing to then build that housing. So that's a good example where there are explicit examples in which not having the proper zoning is one of the main barriers, but it's not the only one. I also just want to reflect on something else in single family zones, which is that we do have existing low-income homeowners in the city of Seattle. And so for them, the homes already provide affordability, especially if they've been purchased a long time ago. And so the question is, how do we maintain and sustain that affordability for certain households? And I think there are a variety of ways in which we can do that through foreclosure and homeowner assistance and home repair. So there are some ways in which the single family fabric, we can continue to provide affordability. And lastly, I'll say to Colin's point is affordability means a lot of things. And so there are some visible ways in which you can replace single family zoning with slightly higher low-rise zoning and turn what could have been one single family home into 8 townhomes on the private market. Now, those 8 townhomes might not be affordable to really low-income people like Tori and Colin and I are talking about, which requires a different level of subsidy. But chances are they are cheaper than us building one single-family home, and they accommodate more people. So again, that's one way in which change of zoning creates some affordability, but it's all in a scale.
Yeah, thank you so much for those thoughts. Tori, what are your thoughts on this issue of, do we need to eliminate single family?
Do we eliminate? Yeah, so my answer to that is I don't think so. I think we do need to do a whole lot of stuff. This will echo a lot of what Emily said, but there are several things we can do. We can expand the zones where the dense multifamily is possible and grow those out. And we're gonna need to do that. We actually still have quite a bit of capacity in those zones, those urban village zones. But of course, as you all know, to redevelop something, there are a couple of things that have to happen. You have to have a willing seller. You have to have a willing seller at a price point that is actually redevelopable. And you are looking at some impacts. There is some displacement of something. Often it's local businesses, it's something. So there are challenges and finding that balance of how much of a type of zoning we need. But there's a big difference between that and wiping out single family zoning, which has a whole lot of other possible consequences. So that's one, expand the zones. Do a better job, second, of tapping into what Colin said, of creating sustainable, affordable options in our edge or low-rise zones. Emily spoke about the townhouse option in those zones. I have a little bit of a pushback on the townhouse thing because in this economic environment we're in, we are building more townhouses. They're more affordable perhaps in this moment than the single family houses, but we're building at a level that is lower, that limits our capacity for that housing in that zone to a bunch of 6 pods essentially of townhouses where we could have a small apartment building. So, and once you've divided up into single family or into single family owned parcels, you can never reconsolidate that land to build at a denser level. So there are these odd twists that you just have to be really cognizant of as you think about that. And that's sort of the unintended consequences element. So do better in the edge zones and then do better at avoiding the unintended consequences of our zoning. So let's not get out ahead with blowing out the zoning issues until we know how we're going to achieve the redevelopment that's needed for that balance of community.
And same question to Colin, because this really is the crux of our issue. And have a 3 or 4 minutes for this question, so we make sure we get the last one. And we've got great audience questions so far. But what are your thoughts on this? Like, can we keep single family and still have affordability?
Yeah, gosh, I wish that it'd be more interesting if the panelists all disagreed and argued with each other, right? I will say I tend to agree. I think that for me, the short answer is we don't need to eliminate single family zoning. We need to really look at it and to Emily's point, find out where it's causing the barriers and try to reduce those barriers. You know, again, for us, it's really providing different opportunities in those zones. It's not a one size fits all model. You know, it just feels like a single family home on a 5,000 square foot lot in Seattle is not accessible to most people, and it's not sustainable for 70% of the area of the city. If we want to develop a place that, you know, is home to families and is home to people of different economic means and different backgrounds. So having different options that I think a key piece of this is affordable home ownership. You know, home ownership is the number one way, I think, that people build wealth, and so that is an important aspect. It could mean, you know, that could be subsidized. It could mean more accessory dwelling units and things like that within single family zoning, allowing again more opportunities there. And then I think the other real key piece on this, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but how to finding ways to reduce displacement. And I think Emily's point really is important, that displacement is not just happening to renters. It's happening to people that have, you know, that have lived in their homes for a long time and are now being pushed out of the city. And different areas of, I mean, that, you know, Central District, we've seen that happen quite a bit, and kind of Rainier Valley, and so having ways that we can also reduce displacement in those areas is important. But I want to kind of loop back to this kind of overarching question of, we just can't talk about single family zoning and displacement without talking about racial equity, and just the impacts on Black, Indigenous communities of color are so disparate, as is homelessness. And we've seen the last few months that the housing in this country is part of the infrastructure, is part of the public health system. You know, it's as you know, we've seen what happens when, for a family that's tripled up or does not have stable housing, they are at so much greater risk for health and other impacts. And so we really do need to have that conversation as a community about equity when we talk about single family zoning.
Maybe we can start right here and kind of, you know, pose the question of, how does multifamily versus single family housing typology really play into the income and racial divides in our city, and how can we, you know, use these tools to reverse economic injustices? And again, I'm going to kick this to Emily first with the kind of the role of government within that topic.
Yeah, so I like to think of that question in a few ways. First, there's the baseline question of whether low-income people have the opportunity to live in Seattle. And then the second piece of that is, if so, where can people live within the city? And I bring up those two things because I think there are different strategies, particularly one's more related to financing and one's more related to zoning, of whether we can build affordable housing at all, which largely requires public subsidy. And two, where can we build it that provides opportunity, community connectedness, and quite frankly, integration and inclusive neighborhoods. And that also more has to do with zoning in where you can build. And so on the first issue, I think that the public sector's responsibility has almost always been in providing subsidy for affordable housing. And part of the challenges we've seen in the last few decades relative to affordable housing has quite frankly been a complete disinvestment by the federal government in creating affordable housing. It was for decades that the federal government had the primary responsibility of supporting low-income housing through investment in public housing, in our public housing authorities. And, you know, there has been a intentional and consistent rollback of that responsibility. And so as we've seen a decrease in public subsidy from a federal level, we have seen are an exacerbation of our affordability and homelessness challenges. You know, fortunately at the local level, we have the commitment and the grace of voters who have supported things like the Seattle Housing Levy for over 30 years, which provides a local fund source to be able to fund permanently affordable housing. And so we need to continue to ask ourselves, this is not just local government, how do we reinvigorate a commitment to providing public subsidy? Once we have the resources, and I'll say this, every year I accept applications for funding for affordable housing, and every year we have more opportunities to invest in than we do have resources. And until we get to the time that we have more money than options, then the zoning question comes even more into play. But right now, we even have a public subsidy gap. Two, I think, go into the question of where. And I believe that fair housing law and the civil rights, you know, the Fair Housing Act makes it essential that the underpinning of creating housing is about creating choice, which means being able to have a choice to live in Magnolia or in, you know, Wallingford or in other typically single family neighborhoods, as well as having a choice to live in Capitol Hill or other dense neighborhoods. And so the way in which we address that choice is really looking at how we're able to accommodate different kinds of housing typologies in every neighborhood. And that's the issue that starts to implicate, do we need to have, I think I popped up on the Q&A, really good questions coming in, do we need to have slightly more diversity in almost all zones? That's an interesting way of thinking about empowering housing choice across the city.
Colin, what are your thoughts on, you know, single family versus multifamily and how that plays into these income and racial divides, either building off of Emily's points or introducing new ones?
Yeah, I think for us, going back to this idea of housing really being, you know, what we're talking about as kind of the output, but not necessarily the outcome. For this topic, you know, the outcome here really is economic empowerment and equity. And so for me, it's kind of going back to that access to opportunity and making sure that that's available to a wide section of the population, as many people as possible. But I also, just to talk specifically about one piece of this, you know, Emily mentioned a little bit on affirmative fair housing marketing, and that's really an area that we have achieved some good results through kind of intentional efforts. We've had projects that have opened up in Seattle that we've done partnerships with community organizations in the neighborhood surrounding those projects, so that you know, we can't say specifically, you can live here, you can't, based on a lot of different factors, but we can really do a lot of intentional work to make sure that, you know, community preference and affirmative marketing to allow these projects to relieve some of that displacement pressure.
Thanks so much. And Tori, what are your kind of final thoughts on this topic? And then we're going to open it up to Q&A after this. Great audience questions, but would kind of love to hear your thoughts on this divide.
Yeah, so I'm just going to echo a theme, and then maybe introduce a notion to just remind us of that theme, which is just in periods of zoning, as we manage our zoning to ensure that it is not the barrier. I love Emily's, you know, framing of this is so key, until clearly from the continued demand for capital to build affordable housing, we have still more opportunities in Seattle than we have capital to do it with. So we got to get that straight. We've talked about that ad nauseum. The unintended expectations, my concern on the equitability issue and the racial issue is about what we don't, is about that displacement when you have redevelopment and how you know, really ensure that, get around that. And I'll leave you with just a little story to kind of trigger that or a situation that I've just been really aligned to. I grew up, frankly, on one side of the red line in the 70s and went to school on the other side of the red line. And it was a really hot issue. But I grew up and frankly had the privilege of going to a predominantly Black high school in a really, what I felt was a very culturally vital time in the central area. So that was sort of my grounding in high school. Love that. For those of you in Seattle can probably anticipate, I went to Garfield. As a minority in that community at that time, and what I have seen since that time in subsequent class reunions is my classmates, my Black classmates particularly, my white classmates often moving further away to other parts of the country and coming back. My Black classmates, this is a generalization, but increasingly moving out of the central area as they establish their own families, moving down to Kent, moving out to other communities, often coming back for church and cultural reasons. Their grandmothers, if they're fortunate to still have them living now, are often the ones still in the family home. And they are right now, because as zoning changes happen, getting a lot of knocks on their door about buying their property, you know, and it will become a series of townhouses at Uptown. And there's this real sense of there's no connection there. There's no how do we find a way to support that property ownership in our family or in the Black community under these pressures, because we haven't gotten ahead of that to say these are some ways to do that. Now that opens up all kinds of other questions and discussions, but you can't just say, okay, now we've got 5 units on this site where we did have just one house. There are just so many human disruptions in that process that we have to be ahead of.
Thank you so much for that response, and that kind of idea of what happens over generations is really, really interesting to talk about, and how people move in and out of different areas. And one of the questions that we have from the audience, actually our first audience question, I think is actually really related to what we're talking about now. So let's start with that from Abby Hogan. So I'm just going to read this out. If multifamily housing is the current target for developing more affordable housing, why are some of the most diverse, both economically and racially, diverse areas of Seattle, such as Rainier Beach, zoned for single family housing, while many new multifamily developments like South Lake Union are known for their lack of diversity? Is diversity a cornerstone of affordable housing, or are they two separate issues?
I would just—
Really good question. Oh, sorry, Tori.
Go ahead, Emily.
It's a really good question. I think there are, as with every issue around housing and land use, there are so many things interwoven in those questions. I mean, first of all, why is Rainier Valley the most racially diverse? Back to my initial point about racial covenants, the Rainier Valley was one of the only places in which people of color could live for decades. And so you continue to see that show up in current times. Now, there has also been a change in the demographics in those communities, and there are people at risk of losing homes, but that's one reason you see that. I think a second issue that question brings up is that in addition to zoning, there are still issues of supply and demand and locations that change the cost and value of land in different areas. And South Lake Union is an example in which the land price is really high. It's an expensive place to buy land for a lot of reasons, and Tori's a good person probably to tease out more of this, but it's more expensive to buy land, and from an affordable housing model, it then makes it more challenging to, even though it's zoned multifamily and appropriately can allow for the development, it's expensive to be able to buy the property and produce affordable housing in that location. So I think that's another piece about it, is that even with the zoning, there are sub-area markets, and inclusionary housing was intended to try to added value in adding capacity and reclaiming that value by having an affordability requirement on top of it. But there are some markets that just remain more expensive, which changes our ability to produce affordable housing in those locations.
I think the overlay you have to keep in mind too, to add on to that, is that you have to look under the surface and say, what is the housing stock in those neighborhoods? The reason, I mean, and because that exacerbates obviously these contrasts. South Lake Union has virtually all been built out just recently. It got built in an economic climate where they were, where developers could make good profits building to the high end of the market, and there was demand for that. The Rainier Valley has been a long time diverse neighborhood, but it was not a center of investment considered attractive enough, though it certainly now is pulling a lot of new folks in. So you just have to look under the surface, because the housing stock is part of the affordability. If you have existing housing stock, that's inherently at a lower cost. So there's just so much interwoven there.
And I'm going to kind of add, there's an add-on to this question that I'm hoping that maybe Colin can help us with, because Colin was talking a bit about the types of housing and kind of mid-rise that it can be very efficient, but we've got this great add-on to this question so we're talking about affordability in different areas and how that plays into diversity. Specifically, are there 3 or even 4-story multifamily housing typologies that can kind of emulate the single-family dwelling, but delivers more efficiencies than a traditional multifamily design? Like, is there any kind of housing product that can, emulate that experience a little bit, but still create efficiencies and density?
Well, as somebody that only does 4-story multifamily housing, I'm not sure I can provide a full answer on this one. I will say that, one thing that we have not done in Seattle, and this is mostly because of a state law, is condominiums. And so that gets a little bit at the home ownership, but in a multifamily setting. So anyway, some of the benefits of home ownership as far as wealth development, but in a very efficient, kind of construction type and things like that. So anyway, there's lots of examples across the country where, New York is a great one. A lot of condominiums, a lot of co-ops, and that just isn't a model that we use, here, particularly recently. So that was the first, anyway.
There's an opportunity there, though. I mean, we could do cooperative as another form of multifamily. And I think it's that we have not had builders that focused on this, because we've had this sort of dichotomy. We have single family, and we've got this very efficient, 5/1 kind of form that has been done well. This is an opportunity for us to build that different kind of lower density, denser housing in the edge zones much better. And it's going to take some changes. One of the impediments for co-op housing is in the financing mechanisms. There are a lot of people working on that right now, and there are also some builders trying to figure out this mid-range, how to do it more efficiently. It's a great opportunity.
Also, Jean Marie, as part of the mandatory housing affordability in the up zones to single family neighborhoods that were very modest, just a few of them, we introduced new typology of an RSL, a residential small lot zone, recognizing that if you reflect and ask yourself, what's the value of single family zoning? I think different people have different perspectives on that. One might be the look and feel of the community, of being able to have more trees, a lower scale. And I do, to the question that was posed, I believe that there are ways to accommodate that feeling with slightly more density than is allowed by single homes on single lots. And the city was trying to crack into that space with an RSL zone. And I think that's a question that we need to consider to ask. Are there ways to achieve additional density in a growing city in single family zones in a way that's more consistent with some of the feelings of the single family zones? And I think that that's possible, and it should be front and center for folks.
Fantastic. that feel of the single family is an interesting point to bring up. The next question that we had from the Q&A, I feel like we've touched on a little bit. I'll go ahead and read it out, and if there's anything else to add. But Brock Howell says, I hear the panelists saying that there's a type of housing is just as important as the quantity capacity allowed under the zoning, given the lack of family-sized housing and home ownership opportunities from everyone from 0 to 120% of area median income. Would it not make sense to expand home ownership opportunities by at least upzoning SFRs to townhomes? I think we've covered a little bit of that. We've talked about different opportunities in terms of co-ops and condominiums. I want to get to one more question after this, but do we have just, in like the next minute or so, anything else to add on that idea of expanding those opportunities?
I mean, I think again that you can expand those opportunities with slightly lower density, like a RSL, a low rise. You can bring in those zones and produce more townhomes and maybe homeownership opportunities at a slightly lower price point than is achieved presently with single family homes. But to make them truly affordable, we then need significant subsidy to bring it down anywhere lower than 120% AMI.
And I just add too, as we look at those edge zones and upzoning them, to not that we shouldn't be timid. We may want to look at minimum zoning density. You may not redevelop something and therefore displace the existing de facto affordable housing there, affordable in the market sense, naturally occurring affordable, without going to a certain scale. Because what we're getting is a whole lot of this interim scale that, frankly, I'm looking out the window at a bunch of townhouses across the way, they all sold for $900,000. That is nowhere close to touching the level of affordability that so, yes, there are now 6 families where there was 1, but they're all making 3 times the income level that that former family was. So it's complicated.
I think real briefly on this one too, this gets at the crux of how we're the juxtaposition between zoning and development, right? Where we're saying so much, anyway, zoning's the foundation, it's fundamental. There's so much more that goes into producing affordable opportunities. And so that's where, if we just upzone the whole city, there'd be a lot of housing developed. I don't know that it would be much affordable housing. I don't know that there'd be any 3-bedroom units. And so it's more than just kind of a blanket upzone. We need to look into these things that Tori's mentioning as well.
So we just have about a minute left. So I think we'll just kind of wrap up here. Sorry if we did not get to your questions. Anyone can send additional questions to Peter, and we can try to see if we can get those. We can answer via email or something like that. But really, I just want to, one other point that we kind of talked about just a little bit, and a final thought to leave everyone with that we kind of talked about when we were getting together as a panel is, if zoning is the foundation and it's part of it, but if it were the answer, then wouldn't Manhattan be affordable? Because there isn't any single family in Manhattan, and we all know that that's not a very affordable place to live. So everyone has to come together, all of these different players, to really create a solution for affordability. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for participating on a Saturday morning with this fantastic symposium, and to thank Seattle University School of Law for hosting this and for allowing us to be part of this day. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and I really appreciate you all being with us today. Stay safe and healthy out there. Bye-bye.